Right, good morning, everybody. And this is our second part of our part one, which we didn't complete last time, which was a few weeks ago. And we're going to be looking at race, the history of race and racism within the UK. So I'm going to go through the slides again. It's going to be a bit quicker this time for the purpose of those of you who attended last session, just to give a recap, a little summary, so you know exactly where we're going or where we're going to take this. So let me just make a start. Let's have a look. Right, okay. So history of race and racism. So we're going to look at 4 or 5 different aspects of the history of race and racism. So the first part we're going to look at is the ancient and modern racial construct. And I think this is important because racism in the Western world didn't really start to manifest itself until approximately the 1600s. And this is true. We know that there was racial conflicts in ancient times. We looked at the religious aspect of the Brahmanism or the Hindu caste system. And we also looked at the Torah and the biblical version of the Hermetic myth, which is called. So we'll look at those. We'll just touch upon those, which we did last time. We're also going to look at the sciences used to justify racialism. Now, the reason why I call racialism, because this was what it was called during the 1960s and 70s. So we didn't say that somebody was a racist. We actually called somebody was a racialist. And it wasn't until the 1980s that obviously the tone or the phrase or the statement changed from racialism to racism. Okay, so if those of you from my generation grew up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would recognize that term. And it's only just to reinforce to those of you who are from a later generation what terminologies were used at that time or before you were born, especially if you were born after 1987, 1988. That's when obviously that term changed. We're also going to look at black and white relationships in Britain. That's looking at it more from a social and a labor market perspective, not so much in intimate relationships. We're also going to investigate the elements of structural, institutional, and systemic or systematic racism, and how that has manifested, especially in the last maybe 20, 30 years. And we're also going to look at the aspects of inequalities and stratifications and its meaning, its understanding, and how that is manifested within society. So we'll make a start. So understanding race. Now, when we're looking at race as a term, we have to take it back to where it really started, round about the early part of the 1600s. So I discussed when the Pope divided the world into two, because the Pope was the main person within Europe. He was the most powerfulest individual within Europe, the Pope. So he divided the world into two. He gave half the world to Portugal, half the world to Spain. Okay, so what happens here, if we look at this part here, where we got Brazil, which is here, from Brazil, Africa, Asia, all that was given to Portugal. So the first colonizers of the Indian subcontinent, if you want to call it that, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, were the Portuguese. And from the line of Brazil, which is, from South America, the Caribbean islands or the West Indies, Central America, North America, all this side here, going over this way, all that was given to Spain. This is why you find that people are still Spanish speaking in mainly Central America, South America, some parts of North America as well, Canada, etc. But what happened over a certain amount of time, around about the 1600s, other European nations came in and they took away that. So the Dutch had taken New York, which was called New Amsterdam. The British came in the early 1600s, as early as 1623, and they took islands like St. Kitts, Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica off the Spanish, and so on and so forth. And the French came in around about the same time. They took the southern domain of the southern states, such as Louisiana and Mississippi. So this is how we have all those different people. So if you look here, you'll notice that you've got all the commodities, minerals, which are being transported. And those are triangular traits. Now, what started happening was when the Europeans began to go into other countries, such as North America, Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia, what they started noticing, there was people, they were encountering people of different skin colors. So the word race actually comes when the European nations, when 7 to 9 of these European nations were racing down to develop the so-called New World to create their own economic markets. And then what they started doing then, they started fighting. And the reason why they ended up stop fighting, they said, look, we need to trade with one another. This is important. We need to trade with one another. We need to have some sort of diplomacy, some sort of negotiation, and let's declare war on the people we have colonized. So the word race came out of the concept of competition, and it went to the 5 different skin colors of the planet. This is how it came about. Okay, so the word race actually means competition. This is where it actually comes from. So all I've given you here is a little summary of where it came from. So white people started to see yellow, red, brown, and black people in these countries or islands that they were colonizing. And that's how they stratified them basically by skin color, not so much by phenotype, you know, shape of nose, shape of lips, texture of hair. It was mainly skin color. All the later classifications came at a much later date. So we also looked at race being a floating signifier by Professor Stuart Hall. He's passed away now. He was born in Jamaica and he ran the cultural studies program in Birmingham University, he was the one which pioneered cultural studies. So what you actually find here is that the reason why I want to show this individual is how racial concepts was basically starting to change in the 1960s and 70s in the academy. And to promote this man, literally to run an intellectual department in the 1970s and through the 1980s, and to take control of that with white people, academics working underneath him, okay, was a monumental change within British society. That this black man from Jamaica was basically able to have respectable Western or British scholars work underneath him, and he was able to delegate and direct them. So this was a slight change in the academies of allowing black people to control faculties or departments, okay, in the 1970s and 80s. And all this came about as a result of what took place during the 1950s and 60s of the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement was just not in United States of America. This is something I want to emphasize. Yeah, okay. Civil rights movement was taking place in the late 1950s and early 60s with the Windrush generation, especially in places like London. So I want you to acknowledge this because there were similarities with like Jim Crowism in America and racial segregation that took place in British society. So the floating signifier, as far as Stuart Hall is concerned, is based upon the elements of signifiers. Okay, so the signifiers here is looking at things like class, gender, sexuality, age, and race. Okay, so these are the things that cause social division within society. So people who come from British society know it's mainly a class dimension. You got upper class, lower class, middle class. Okay, you got the aristocracy, you got the elites within that society. So you have different class distinctions within British society. This doesn't play out in every other society. We also know there's gender stratifications or inequalities that take place within British or Western society. Okay, and then we have elements of sexuality, age, and race. Now, the aspect of gender, sexuality, or gender and race don't really come into the academies until about the 1960s as a result of the civil rights movement. So when civil rights groups within the 1960s were protesting to have more of civil order within society. You found that the gender movement came in much later with the feminist, what would be called the feminist movement. And obviously the gay liberation movement came in on the backs of the civil rights movement. And what you started to see that gender and sexuality along with race was slowly being taught within the American academies. And slowly that was then being transferred into British universities. So what is a floating signifier? Well, a floating signifier, if we're looking at race, which Stuart Hall talks about now. He says, whoops, sorry about that. So what he basically says is that race is at the center, and it takes on different forms in trying to express a meaning and understanding towards racial classifications or racial groups. So what happened, you found that race started to enter into things like the sciences, so biological and genetics. Then it took another form of the social, historical, and cultural elements. So we start to see that race started to be defined within the disciplines or the sciences, okay, of what you call it now, sociology, history, and anthropology, okay? This is what comes out here. And then later on, race started to become defined and moved into the political and the legal arena. Then we know that it was for centuries, it was in the religious context. And we also know from 1750 onwards, philosophers started to talk about race. So that's what makes it a floating signifier. It floats. It floats between different disciplines at different times within European society, especially in the 1600s. But we do know when we look before the 1600s, we do know that racial classifications of race or religious classification of race goes back centuries before. So that's what it means about a floating signifier. It goes through science, then it goes through sociology, history, culture, which is anthropology. It goes through the political and legal system. When you're occupying countries, they made sure that darker skinned people, for instance, were a pariah status at the bottom of the social ladder, and so on and so forth. So the next thing here we're going to look at is the formation of this floating signifier. So the floating signifier in this case, it looks at and it tries to formulate different aspects within the thought process of human beings, whether they are the dominant or subordinate groups. So the first thing is looking at language. So we're looking at verbal or non-verbal forms of communication. And within that context of looking at the different forms of communication that comes out from the lesser groups and the more dominant groups, there's the particular perceptions, attitudes, concepts, and thoughts. And no, they will formulate itself within a context. Okay, so obviously there's a form of defamation. You try to put people down, especially if they were people whose land was being occupied. They looked at particular events. Okay, so they may have looked at ceremonies, etc. We're also looking at the cultural elements as well. So looking at people's culture. So for instance, when people were wearing earrings in their nose and in their lips, it was considered barbaric. But now in the 21st century, it's considered a fashion statement. It was never the fashion statement by Europeans when Africans were wearing, things in their nose, rings in their nose, in their lips. But since white people in the Western world are doing it now, it's now considered a cultural practice, a cultural definition, etc. So unfortunately, what takes place, there's an ethnocentric perspective. In other words, looking at people's cultures through their own cultural lens. So just because a culture doesn't practice X, Y, and Z, it is determined as being A, B, and C, okay? Rather than looking at it from the perspective of the group that they're observing. Because it was anthropologists, it was colonial administrators who first formulated concepts of people's culture. Okay, because when the British, say for instance, went to places like Africa or went to places like North America, they sent anthropologists to go and study the people, to understand their behavior in order to control them effectively.
Morning.
That's what that comes about.
You're right.
Hello? Okay, so we looked at all these. I won't read through all these, like I said, but I will send the slides over to you, etc., because there's a lot to get through. So we got the Hamitic myth. Okay, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So Ham in the biblical or the Torah understanding is supposed to be the father of the black race. Then Sam or Shem is supposed to be the father of Semitic races, and Japheth is supposed to be the father of the Indo-European groups. Okay, and what was supposed to happen is a story about Noah being naked, who was a prophet of God. And what happened was he was supposed to have been drunken, and the three sons came in at similar times, but Ham was supposed to have laughed at his father's nakedness because he was being drunk. And what happened was when Noah got up, he's supposed to have cursed Ham. But the works in Genesis actually says, cursed be Canaan. And Canaan was the son of Ham. And obviously his destination or settlements was in places like Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Okay, so even within the biblical text, there's a misinterpretation of what Noah was supposed to have said. Okay, and what was being taught during slavery was that this would be shown to the enslaved people in the Caribbean or within America, and saying that you should enjoy slavery, etc., because it was ordained by God. And this was a type of philosophy or religiosity which was used in order to justify the transatlantic enslavement period. Then we looked at high cultures of darker skinned people again. So we looked at Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro is in what is known as Pakistan, or what was known as Sindh. Okay, and Mohenjo-Daro was a civilization which was created by Black people, Black Indians in India. This was centuries before white people came into those equatorial regions. This is really important here. So remember, the southern part of the equator, where the hot part, there was only dark people there, and genetic evidence is telling us this. Okay, and they were a high civilization. You can see on the right-hand side, most of their buildings, okay, and very sophisticated, okay, civilization, yeah, rivaled ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer. This is how powerful and intricate this civilization was by dark-skinned people. And obviously you have a sewage system and bath water, which is running in the cities. So this was very high tech at the time. And we're going back about 5,000 years ago. This is how far we're going back, 5,000 years ago. And this is before the white Indo-Europeans came in. And these groups of people that came into this region are now the people which we would call Indians, Afghanis, Kurdish, Turkish, okay? It's those groups of people which came in, okay? And we know they came in because they are cousins to one another. They share a similar linguistic family. This is why they call the country Hindustan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, okay, Kurdistan, Turkestan, okay? They come from a similar language group. So it's these white people that came into these regions and started to change the social dynamics. And there's Harappan civilization, which is in the Punjab region. So these black, what was known as Dravidian civilization, or these black Indians, had created civilization before white people came there. So this is really important here. So that part, so when we look at ancient Sumer, we know it's a black civilization. Sumer actually means the black-headed people, or the black ones, or black-headed ones, okay? And this is where we get the word summer from the Sumerians, etc. So the earliest civilizations were controlled, organized, developed by darker-skinned people.
What's up? What's up?
So here you can see the cultural diffusion. Okay, diffusion basically means movement. So on the right-hand side, you can see where the early Indo-European settlers came from Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, okay, Iran, Pakistan, and they moved into the southern Asiatic part of the continent. Okay, and then we got India. So the word like Pakistan, for instance, comes from the word Pak, which means pure. Okay, so the Aryans come, and this is where Hitler got his ideas from, of the Aryans, these white people that came into Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, which we would call in today's society. The part which they took over, which is the green here, if you notice here, was known as Aryavata. Aryavata means the land of the Aryans. It's a Sanskrit word which means either noble or pure. So they use deliberate terms in order to justify themselves in a hierarchical structure. This is how this comes about. So this is really important. So you can see where white people started to come in between 1500 BC to around about 700 BC. So they come at a very later period. And if you look at genetic evidence, say for instance, they say that man or mankind or humankind goes back at least 90,000 to 200,000 years ago. So we know that people with dark skin, Europeans or lighter skinned people, didn't mutate until the last 20,000 years. And that was because of the warm interstadial, or the ice age, which was within the northern caps of the globe. The Ice Age came in for approximately 15 to 20,000 years. You can read the works of Nina Jablonski, who talks about this. And what happened was Africans were caught in the ice. They had to lose their skin color, okay, in order to cope and to survive in these icy zones, which is known as the glaciational period. Okay, and then as the ice started to recede, many of them started to move down with lighter skin. And that's how people started to change. So it's known as the monogenetic fact, not theory. We all come from one and one from all. Okay, and this is what came out of this study with Rebecca Cann in the late 1980s from the University of Hawaii, along with the University of Berkeley, which is in California. So that's what that came about with the genetics and understanding lineage, etc. So what happened when these white people came in, they started to stratify the culture. So all those white people which came in fell into these three different categories. So the Brahmins were the priestly or the elite class. And then the Kshatriyas were your military and administration, who wore the yellow dot. So the white dot was put on the head of the Brahmin, the priestly class. The yellow dot on the military and the administration. And the Vishas were the merchants and the farmers. And that's the one we're probably more common with within British society, with the red dot on the head. And they were distinguished markers for white supremacy. This is basically what it was. And this is how this came about. Some scholars say that the caste system is approximately 6,000 years old, but some are saying it's much later. So we're probably talking about 3,500 to 4,000 years old. The caste was a caste system. Caste means your position within society, but the elites or the Aryans that came in, the white people that came into what we now call India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they didn't call it the caste system. They called it Varna. Varna means color, skin color. Okay, this is important here. Varna means skin color. Caste is jete. So there's different understandings. So they put people into skin color, which is known as Varna. So it's clear they were discriminating people on skin color. And once they had located them into that group, then they started to initiate different types of professions, work or jobs for people. So you had the Sudras, which had the black dot. They were the despised, the original people of India. Okay, they were moved at the bottom of the social ladder. And then we know about the untouchables. The untouchables was a concept when the British Raj was in India. This is what they started noticing. And this is where the British, just to a large degree, learned the racial system. This is where they learned it from. Okay, this is where they learned it, and this is really important. The Portuguese as well, which were there before the British took over, and the Dutch had learned the racial system from the Indian caste system, what we would now call the Indian caste system. Some people like to say Hinduism, but I prefer to say Brahminism, okay, rather than Hinduism, because most Hindus, not all, but most Hindus do not subscribe or practice this concept of jati or the caste, okay? Is or varna or skin color coded coordination. But the people like to call themselves the Dalits. The Dalits, the black people like to call themselves Dalits, which comes from a Hebrew word which means the broken ones. Okay, where the dark-skinned people with the black dots cannot gain upward mobility. So you find they're not the farmers, they're not the merchants, they don't work in the military, they don't work in administration, and they certainly don't work within the priesthood. These are the ones which literally do all the dirty work. This is how they stratified or created the caste system from the color-coded system, which we would call pigmentocracy. Pigmentocracy is a system in which people are layered in society based upon their skin color. It's what we call pigmentocracy or pigmentocratic. So this is just an idea of telling you how the caste system came into being. So on the right-hand side, you see two Dravidian girls or untouchables, what they were called untouchables. And then I'm just going to go through a couple of these on the left-hand side. So it was called Varna. Varna means color, not caste or jete. Okay, so it's based upon color gradations, and then the laws of Manu had stipulated the following. They thought their shadow was polluting. So if a Dravidian, a dark Dravidian, which was known as a Sudra or untouchable, was walking, it was not permissible for the three top groups within the caste system to walk behind them. So not only they couldn't touch them, even their shadow was considered polluting. Cups were worn around their necks in order to catch their saliva because they were considered disgustingly dirty and polluted. This was socially constructed. The Varna system or the caste system is socially constructed, okay? It wasn't a natural order of things. It became ordered once the Aryans had taken over the land, okay, subjugated the people and made them into pariah status. Okay, so there, I'm not going to read through it all, but there are just some of the things that was ruled, and it still exists even till today. Most people from what was known as the Indian subcontinent like to downplay this reality. But if we look at the system, we will notice that the dark-skinned Dravidian populations are very much not in the decision-making leadership positions within the country. You don't find them in the political system. You don't find them the heads of the educational system. You don't find them much in the entertainment system unless they're being ridiculed. They're not part of the legal system, the political system, and so on and so forth. And even when we look at the religious orders, etc., we notice there are lighter skinned people at the top. This is how it was stratified, and it still exists even till today. Okay, so even though people may say, well, it doesn't exist, like people used to say racism doesn't exist, it does within the social structures. This is where we're going to talk about structural racism, etc. later on. So here is just another thing of looking at the ways in which the ancient Egyptians saw themselves. So this was taken from the tombs of Ramses III. Okay, this is the 20th dynasty, and the Egyptians are A, okay, B are the Indo-Europeans, C are other Africans, and D are your Semitic types. But if you look closely, you'll notice the Egyptians see themselves as the rest of Africans. So if the Egyptians saw themselves as being dark-skinned people or black people, why is it that Egyptologists have a problem in accepting how the Egyptians describe themselves? And they describe them, and obviously they give a definition, okay, or picture of the other two groups who they associated with or lived at their time, which are Semitic and Indo-Europeans. So this is important. So race classification, especially in Africa or East Africa, North Africa, and what we now call the so-called Middle East, okay, there were distinctive colored groups, but there was not a case of like racism, if we look at it from that perspective, okay? So we're gonna look at racist and race justification. I'm just going to flick through this. This is just reinforcing what I said earlier about it being a floating signifier. So I talked about the caste system, which theology was justifying, and what took place in the biblical or the Torah scriptures. Philosophy comes around about the 1700s. It has its say. Biology or science comes around about a similar time. And what we're starting to find is that all these disciplines like anthropology, psychology, and sociology are all going to have a say about race, race classification, race justification, etc. So we looked at the theory of evolution. The only thing I want to emphasize on this one is natural selection. And natural selection is looking at the hierarchical structure. And because British people believe when they went and colonized places like Australia and New Zealand and the West Indies and North America and other places as well, they believed in Darwin's theory of evolution about this natural selection, which was referred to as the survival of the fittest. So the fittest people on the planet were white people. They were civilized. The other groups were either savage or barbaric. And that's how philosophy comes in the 1700s and stratifies groups of people based upon their phenotype or genotype into these different categories or classifications. So we looked at Francis Galton. I'm just going to go through these. And what I'm going to do now, we're going to look at different aspects of racial classification. So we looked at W.E.B. Du Bois, which said that Europeans had a fascination because W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Black graduate of Harvard University to receive a PhD. Okay, he was African American. And he was a historian, a sociologist, an economist. So he talks about that if you look at the European literature at the time, they focused primarily on color, bone, and hair. Okay, so they're looking at skin color, the shapes of bones, especially the skulls, and the texture of hair. This is what the Europeans were fascinated about, especially in the 1800s, okay, and the turn of the 20th century. So here is just some quotations for W.E.B. Du Bois, but I'm just going to look at two aspects here. Although the wonderful development of humans' history teach that the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone go but a short way towards explaining the different roles which groups of men have played in human progress. So skin color doesn't determine a person's position within society unless it's socially constructed to put them in that place. That's what he's basically saying here. So depending on your color, hair, and your bone structure, okay, that was basically socially constructed to determine your place within society. So it's not the natural law of things. He also goes on to say that color does not agree with texture of hair. For many of the dark races have straight hair, because there was this notion back in the 1700s, the 1800s, that Black people had Afro hair or curly hair. This is not true, especially if you look at the Aboriginal groups of people. Aborigines got black skin, very dark skin, but they have straight hair. So what you'll find, and we know that dark-skinned people, they also have green eyes, and we've seen this amongst the Aborigines. They have green eyes, blue eyes, hazel eyes. So what anthropologists are trying to do is trying to neatly slot different racial groups into particular categories, but it didn't fit. And this was the problem. They started to see diversity and variety providing difference within a cultural group, within different lands that they were occupying. Okay, so he goes on to say that of hair, for many of the dark races have straight hair, nor does color agree with the breadth of head. For the yellow Tatar has a broader head than the Germans. Okay, we have at least two or perhaps three great families of human beings: the whites, the Negroes. Negroes are spelled with a small n because around about 1776 and onwards, darker skinned people relegated to be non-human. It's what they call the 3/5 compromise, which meant they were only 3/5 of a human being. Okay, so they were literally chattel animals. This is how it came about, of the defamation or the demeaning of darker skinned people in the so-called New World. So when Afrocentrics came out now, reviewing race as a floating signifier, they started to collate an understanding of what they refer to as scientific colonialism, which was nothing more than ethnocentrism, where Europeans were seeing darker skinned people within their own lenses, not coming out of their own cultural practices to understand the behavioral patterns or thought patterns of darker skinned people. So the first one is unsophisticated falsification. This means where Europeans deliberately went out of their way in the so-called New Worlds and these countries they were occupying to tell lies upon the people. This is what it means, unsophisticated falsification. So it was lies, myth, legends, in order to demean the truth, especially if the truth had any meaning, well, okay, within that cultural society. It was a way of trying to demean them, to justify their occupation, because they had to appeal to the poorer people within their society in order to fight their wars. The monarchy wasn't going to fight their own wars in this country. They were sending poor white people from this country to go and fight their wars. So they had to try to justify it in some way by telling lies. Then the next one was integrated modification. So they would take the lie and they would modify it in some way. And then the last one was conceptual incarceration, where groups of people were locked into that way of thinking. So to give an example, they say that Europe is a continent. Europe is not a continent. If we understand geography, okay, we will know that a continent is a large body of land surrounded by ocean. Europe is not surrounded by ocean. Europe is more or less, Europe is Western Asia, because Europe is connected to Asia. There is no barrier between Asia and Europe, okay? They put the barrier there. So this is just to give you an example, okay, of conceptual incarceration. And 99.9% of geography teachers within the British academies teach that Europe is a what? A continent. Europe is not a continent. It's not a continent. It doesn't have the conventions or the dimensions of a continent. It is Western Asia. And that is what scientific colonialism does. It tells a lie, it modifies and rectifies that lie, okay? And then it locks people into that way of thinking. So many of you may have not noticed that before. You've just taken for granted that Europe is a continent. Europe has never been a continent, will never be a continent, and is not a continent. So this is important information for us to know this, you know? So that's just me emphasizing the aspect of scientific colonialism. So if they did it with land, they must have done it with people, okay? And if they've done it with people, they must have stratified people, making them into other than what the people saw themselves as. So here now is Charles Montesquieu. Charles Montesquieu is one of the leading fathers of the Enlightenment period. Now, I won't read it all, but I'm only going to focus on the yellow quotation, where he refers to us as these creatures. So by the 1700s, dark-skinned people were looked upon as creatures, less than something at the bottom of people's feet or shoes. These creatures are all over black with such a flat nose. So what he's doing here, Charles Montesquieu, is identifying color, okay, skin color, and one of our main phenotypes having a flat nose, because Europeans have like straighter noses or alkaline noses. So this is what he's identifying, okay? All over black with such a flat nose that they can scarcely be pitted, which means they all look alike. We can't tell the difference between them. It is hardly to believe that God, who is a wise being, should place a soul, especially a good soul, in such a black, ugly body. This is what Charles Montesquieu. So this floating signifier that Stuart Hall talks about, now race goes into the fields of philosophy. So philosophy is having its say now. Science had its say, religion had its say, okay? Anthropology had its say. Now philosophy is having its say. And all we're seeing now is the aspect of defamation. And the thing is, what I want to emphasize here is that we can understand how Charles Montesquieu constructs this. Yeah, okay, he basically listening to the narratives by colonizers, colonial administrators. He's listening to all these type of things, and then he is constructing this world. There's hardly any truth in this statement at all, except for the fact that people were dark-skinned and they had flat noses. But everything else was something which was socially constructed. Okay, a good soul. A good soul was for white people or white Europeans. So so darker skinned people must have had a bad soul. That's how that comes about. And then when we start to see other ones, you know, the father of the Enlightenment period, the Scottish David Hume, okay, where he now turns around to say, using philosophy, there never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than whites, nor even an individual eminent, either in action, means behavior, or speculation, in thought. No ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, no sciences. But I just showed you the ancient Egyptian civilization. I talked about the Sumerian civilization and Dravidian civilization of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. So what they're trying to do, now we see a whitewashing. This is scientific colonialism. Unsophisticated falsification, we're going to lie. Integrated modification, we're going to modify it now. We're going to amalgamate all this together to cause confusion, to conceptually incarcerate, to lock people into that way of thinking. And then about 120, 130, 120 to 50 years later, Arnold Toynbee, known as a leading historian, says exactly the same thing. The Black race has not helped to create any civilization. So he studied 21 civilizations, and none of them were Black, according to this individual here, even though white people were not in some of the places where these civilizations had occurred. So you can see a similarity between this quotation that comes approximately 150 years later and what David Hume says. So philosophy does its own. History now starts to have some say in race. So you can see what is happening now. All these different disciplines now are going to have some sort of say in the racial composition of people. And then we have the likes of Abraham Lincoln. So one of the things I want to emphasize here, Abraham Lincoln is credited for passing the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was written and established of September of 1862. And he turns around and he says that because what happened was the states had, the southern states had collectivized, called themselves the Confederate States. There was about 11 different nations within that, Florida, Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina, so on and so forth, Alabama, Tennessee, so on and so forth. Okay, so they end up creating a state breaking away from the Union. And this is just before that, this is during the event of the Civil War. But even though he's saying this, Abraham Lincoln himself is supporting slavery in the southern states. Because if you read the Emancipation Proclamation clearly, he says basically that if you come back into the Union before January the 1st of 1863, you can keep slaves. This is what Lincoln says. But if you don't, your slaves are free. Now, the problem is, how can Lincoln free slaves in countries or nations that are rebelling against him? He can't do it. So he didn't free a single person under the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is another scientific form of colonialism, where he's supposed to free, he didn't free a single slave. Abraham Lincoln himself, his mother, Nancy Hanks, who is a relation to Tom Hanks. Okay, Tom Hanks is related to Abraham Lincoln. Most people don't know that. And they are Melungeon people. Melungeon people are they're mixed with Native American and African. Okay, she turns around, and when she was being interviewed before she passed away, she turned around and said Abraham Lincoln's father was actually a Negro slave. That's what she says. So Abraham Lincoln was mixed race. We know that he was mixed, but we didn't know what type of mixture he was. However, he was upholding white supremacy within the nation because he was able to pass. Even if you look at some of the democratic images of Abraham Lincoln, they have him with Afro hair and Afro beard, etc. He started getting lighter, he started getting older, and his hair started to get slightly straighter. But what he's saying, I'm not going to read through all this, but what he's basically saying here, that he doesn't see the social equality between the Black and the white race. And this is supposed to be the person who's supposed to have abolished so-called slavery. This is what is made to believe. Okay, so this is important for us to acknowledge the role that Abraham Lincoln played. Abraham Lincoln was only concerned about what? Saving the Union. And he says, if I can free the slaves and save the Union, I will do it. If keeping them in bondage and saving the Union, I will still do it. So this is true. So this is another form of scientific colonialism now. So now all of a sudden now you have elements of scientists now, naturalists, the likes of Linnaeus, okay? He's a Swedish naturalist, etc. And now he's studying things like plants, and he is now making definitions, characterizing dark-skinned people, white people. So he came and believed there was 4 different types of races. There was a red race, a white race, a yellow race, and a black race. So this is how he starts to formulate race in the 1700s. Now, what he basically says here about the Homo europaeus, okay, he says they are white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by law, which means that they are beautiful looking, they're gentle in their character, okay? They are very much into family, structure, etc., and they're governed by law. This is what he says about Europeans. Now let's look at Omo Haffa now. He says, as black, phlegmatic, cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, and governed by caprice. Why is he putting lazy and lustful? He's putting lazy down for the simple reason because the people who call themselves planters and merchants didn't really work. The work was actually done by slaves. So in order to make white people who were planters and merchants feel good about their position, he wanted to attribute their laziness to dark-skinned people. And the reason why he put lustful was that it was a way of justifying, because within the West Indies or the Caribbean islands in North America, raping black women or dark-skinned women was legal. So to say that they were lustful it was a way of trying to brush aside the aspect of a system of rape, which was legalized. Rape was legalized in all these colonies, okay? They had the right to do that. A dark-skinned woman had no rights over their body. And it didn't get recognized that it was a crime until after 1969 in America. That's when it was actually considered illegal. So it was legal to rape dark-skinned women. That's what he's saying lustful, and trying to talk about, because the lustfulness actually came from the planters, the merchants, the men of profession. So this is how they were using things. So this is how they were using things in order to justify their position, their station in the so-called New World. And then later on, round about just before 1776, 1775, Blumenbach decides to critique races. Okay, he says there's 5 races on the planet, all with skin color. Okay, he adds another one, but this is where he basically used the word Caucasian. And this is where the word Caucasian was born, in the fields of science or the fields of philosophy. So science and philosophy comes together around this particular period in order to crystallize an understanding about different racial groups. So let's look further to the contemporary now. So that's the British Empire. You can see there. Okay, so you can see all that there. All the red is the British Empire. Okay, so this is what is said. During the period of empire, racism permeated every field of intellectual life in Britain. In no field was its influence more pervasive and more pernicious than historiography. Children and young people were taught a version of history which idealized and glamorized Britain and portrayed Black people as inferior. This is in Britain, not just in Britain, this is throughout the British Empire. So what the author is saying here is basically that was the information, Peter Fryer, that was the information which was being brought in North America, Canada, most of these countries in Africa during colonization and colonialism, okay? Parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand. This is where this information was taken. Most of the respected names in British 19th century historiography were racist, and most of them reflected in their writing racist ideology. So history comes in and does his bit. Philosophy, science, anthropology, okay, psychology, sociology, so on and so forth. And this is how children were taught within school. So these are just 2 people, contributors to the British Empire's literature of racist literature, Agatha Christie and Enid Blyton. So these are the books I was exposed to. Many of you my age were exposed to these books in British schools. Okay, these books were not taken out of British schools until when? Until around about the mid-1980s in some of them. Okay, the more Black population you had within schools was the earliest they took these things out. I know in the school I went, they started throwing these books out around about 1979. Okay, and this was written by these 2 white women who were prolific authors in children books. The Little Gollywogs, okay, The Little Black Dog, The 10 Little Niggers, okay? So what you notice, the 3 Gollywogs, okay, they're talking about children now. This was a way of them trying to demean children. So in the playgrounds now, we were reading these books within class, or the teachers were reading it, and then the children would try to call us names. And if you notice there, it's got the little black dog. They're attacking children in books now. Black children are being attacked in books by these 2 white female authors, Agatha Christie and Enid Blyton. Okay, the 10 Little Niggers, which they now call the 10 Little Indians to be politically correct. These are the books that these women wrote. They were writing about children, Black children, attacking children, okay? And these were the intellectual elite which was doing this within the British Empire. And this work was spread all over the British Empire, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, in Canada, North America, all the English-speaking countries which were occupied. This literature went viral, literally. Okay, so let's have a look at one of the books, The Little Black Doll. In Eden Blyden's The Little Black Doll, first published in 1937 and reissued in 1965. A doll's black face is a feared stigma which has to be removed before this doll can be accepted by the other toys. We know they're talking about children. Toys don't speak or move. They don't. So we know they're talking about children. This is when them trying to be clever now. Okay, the black doll has to suffer, act as a servant, which means a slave, and undergo ritual purification by water. Once he has become pink instead of black, he can't become white because why? Because he's dark and he's contaminated. This is what is being taught in children's books right up until the 1980s. Okay, he is a nice doll. He's a nice looking doll. That's because he's pink now, as good as any other, and thinks that the toys will perhaps like him now. He is no longer different. He's almost the same as them. So don't be surprised when we see the British Empire the way it is and why people have the concepts they hold even to today, even at the most pervasive level, whether it is consciously done or unconsciously done. Then we have Mamie Clark and Dr. Kenneth Clark. 2 years after the book was written, the doll study came out. Most of you know about the doll study, the black doll, white doll study. Okay, it was Mamie Clark. Even though Kenneth Clark is credited with that, it was literally given to Mamie Clark. Okay, because she had the white dolls and she had an inferiority complex against herself. So this is what they said in 1947 when they decided to compile their report. Clark and Clark found that black children preferred white dolls and rejected black dolls when asked which were nice, which looked bad, which they would like to play with, and which was the nice color. This suggested that black children had negative attitudes towards themselves and their cultural background. So they had a inferiority complex of who they were and the cultural background they came from. This was in America. Similar studies being done in the UK, and we get similar results where black children or darker skinned children will prefer to choose the white doll. Even with that black dolls now with straight hair and weaves are still not being chosen. Okay, they're still not being chosen. So even though they may have a European phenotype, they're still going for the white dolls. So we really need to look at all these things. So Kenny Davis, an award-winning documentary, try and get this documentary if you can. It was done approximately about 10 to 13 years ago, A Girl Like Me. You can see where she's got a white doll and a black doll. So she didn't have any problem. She's a director now, this young woman. She conducted a study in one of the inner cities, and what she found out, of the 21 black children, okay, 15 of them preferred, chose, or regarded the white doll in high esteem. And this is in the 21st century. So we have to look at billboards and magazines, advertisements, marketing. We got to look at history and geography. We need to look at economics. We need to look at philosophy and science and anthropology and sociology. We need to look at all these because they've all played a way in trying to develop things. So now you can see how structural racism comes into play now. Okay, this was a jam jar. These are things which were basically being advertised, you know, the gollywog, etc. Okay, until African Caribbeans and West Africans in this country in the 1970s and most of the 80s decided for Robinson's strawberry jam to take these images off because this is a form of ridicule. This is what it's about. Okay, so obviously we talk about the, you know, the three little gollywogs. This is what it was that was written by Enid Blyden. This is how this comes about. And it was about children. It was about ridiculing dark-skinned children. So when we're looking at a philosophy, when we're looking at sociology and psychology in the modern era, we're looking at attitudes, okay, behavior and outcomes. So the attitudes, if it's psychological, is prejudicial. If it's sociological, it's what they refer to as cultural racism. So sociology is the interactive mechanisms. Okay, prejudice is the mindset. Okay, when we look at those things, we look at behavior. Okay, from a psychological aspect, people could be discriminatory. And in the social realm, it would be considered racialism. Okay, racialism, or what we now call racism. And if you look at the outcomes of this type of attitude and behavior, we find it's group formation. We are superior, we are better, okay, and so on and so forth. And that is what constitutes institutionalized racism. Institutionalized racism actually came as a concept during the civil rights movement of the late 1960s, okay? And that's how you get structural racism. And what structural racism is where a group of people structure things within their organizations, within their companies, within their businesses, whatever the case may be, based upon skin color. And usually you find group formation is what they refer to as group closure. They close their ranks, they close their groups. You're the out group, we are the in group. This is how these dynamics play out within the labor market, especially in the private sector. Okay, you'll find this. It is in the public sectors, but you're now seeing it more prone within the private sectors where they want to keep those institutions light or white because it's right. This is how this comes about. Structural and institutional racism. So this is just to emphasize Stokely Carmichael and Hamilton, they had coined the term institutionalized racism, yeah, in the latter part of the 1980s. Okay, so when they looked at the Macpherson reports after the Stephen Lawrence case, where they talk about institutionalized racism, it wasn't Macpherson that coined this term. This term was already coined during the civil rights era of the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael was Trinidadian, and obviously he was part of SNCC, which is a Student Nonviolent Coordinative Committee in America, where they were trying to get people in Mississippi to vote, because Mississippi was a Black majority. Okay, that was a state that Black people could have taken under the guise or the understanding of democracy. And obviously we know about the film Mississippi Burning and the type of lynchings took place in Mississippi because whites were outnumbered in places like Mississippi. And Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, went there to try to encourage Black people who've been intimidated to vote. This is what's important here. So looking at institutional racism, I won't read through all this. You can read through all with most of this yourself, but we have to look at racism as a system. It's systemic. It's not just local, it's national. It's also international. And I showed you the map when we're looking at the aspects of the British Empire, for instance. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave it there. We can have maybe a 5-10 minute break, and then we could come back, probably finish off a few slides if there's no question and answers, and maybe that will generate some form of question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, if we come back at, shall we say,
Right. Welcome back, everybody, and thanks. I notice I haven't had time to look at the chat, but I can see that some of you are communicating. I'd like to see if there's any questions that you've already posed to me. So when we're looking at racism, prejudice, discrimination, white supremacy, whatever you want to call it, because it manifests in different ways, whether we're looking at it as structural racism or institutional racism. There are 4 aspects that we look at as sociologists that look at health. And there are 4 aspects. So we look at the individual, the family, the locality, and the society. So first and foremost, we need to look at ourselves as individuals, our thought pattern, our feelings, and our behavior. This is what's really important. And then we are influenced by other entities, other forms of institutions. So then we have the family. So a family can be all sorts. So we have the matrifocal family, the matriarchal family, the patriarchal family, extended family. There are so many different families, okay? So we learn a lot of stuff through our familial interaction. This is where we get some of our concepts from, okay? Not all the time, because I know in some situations whereby people may come from racist families, but they're not racist themselves, okay? And that is because they've made their own independent choice as children or young adults not to discriminate or be prejudicial, because they actually see the people from where they're at, not looking at stereotypes and labelings and using that to increase their so-called understanding in a negative manner or negative way. So families are contributing factors. Localities look at small units of communities, okay? How that can shape our mentality and shape our minds. And the last one is society. The society is much wider, and we're now looking at institutions such as schools, the political system, the legal system. We're looking at religious systems. We're looking at the military. We're looking also at the labor system, or labor institutions, entertainment, education, and the economy. Okay, this is what is important here. And they are all the ways that people socially interact within society. Whether they want to or not, you're going to interact with people, whether through verbal or non-verbal forms of communication. So even though you may not speak to people from other ethnic groups or racial groups, etc., you will encounter them somewhere in your life, or somewhere on your job, or somewhere through your travels. Okay, this is important. Right, change. Okay, so these are just different forms of racism. So we looked at scientific racism. So we looked at what role science had in understanding or trying to construct things, looking at the intellectual inferiority. So they would look at phrenology, which looked at the skull, and because Black people were supposed to have had smaller skulls, they were supposed to be known as being genetically inferior or intellectually inferior. That's what came out of scientific racism, if you look at it from that perspective. That links to biology or biological racism. So that's looking at phenotypes. So looking at lips and you know, looks at lips and hair and all these other different types of things, okay? So we even know, even within the dominant culture, you know, people with what they call red hair, or what is known as ginger hair or copper hair, they now would say it's strawberry blonde. Why strawberry and blonde? It's not really red, it's not really blonde, because blonde is the acceptable color for whiteness or Europeanness. This is why they call that. So there's even a problem amongst white people with different types of phenotype. If you look at the hair products, say for instance, within Britain, etc., more hair straighteners are sold to white females than hair curlers. So that goes to show the large amount of the population of white females have got curly hair. And I even heard only recently, where a young girl was given bread on the bus, and she basically turned around and said, "Oh, I don't want to eat the ends of the bread." And when someone asks why you don't eat the ends of the bread, because it'll make my hair curly. Children are being trained to dislike particular phenotypes. This is subtle. So just like what Enid Blyden and all these people did in literature, we ourselves sometimes, are perpetuating these things even to our children, socializing them, educating them without them realizing. Then we have elements of physical racism, which is about the physical attacks because of our own perception and our own emotion towards certain people, okay? And that could be done orally or physically. So just because you may attack somebody orally doesn't mean they're not being attacked, doesn't mean they're not being attacked. Okay, it may start off orally before it becomes physical. Then we looked at institutional racism or institutionalized racism, which is liberally established stratification, where people are layered. There's a certain group of people at the top, a certain group of people down the bottom. This is by design. Okay, this is by design. Okay, structural racism is the way they order things within a company. So this is more active racism. Okay, within the workplace, i.e. non-promotion, where certain groups of people from a particular ethnic group do not see promotion, and there's a massive amount of wage disparities. Studies have even shown that when darker skinned people get into high profile jobs through promotion, they're paid less than the person who was previously there who was white. Okay, this is done by design. This is happening as we speak now. Okay. And then we have systemic racism, okay? This looks more at policy. So this is where the political system and the legal system come together in order to create policies, in order to stratify and to make sure that melanated groups of people stay in their place because they're considered a threat. Okay, so let's have a look at game theory. So game theory is based upon 4 different factors. You have people who are designers, advocates, players, and pawns. So the designers, when we're looking at structural racism or institutionalized racism, who are the designers? What color are they? Which class of people do they come from? They're usually middle class, white, okay, upwardly mobile, who are trying to retain or maintain the status quo of the legal and the political system. They are the designers. Designers are people who put the system together, okay, to cause systemic or institutional racism. Then we have the advocates. The advocates are those groups of people who reinforce it in some way. So you have the CEO of companies, you've got the middle managers, okay? They're the middle managers, maintaining that structure, okay? So they work underneath the designers. Then you have the players. These are people of all groups of people who perpetuate the systemic or institutionalized racial formation within the workplace. Okay, so the people who are the victims are sometimes upholding this consciously, sometimes unconsciously, as well as people from the dominant culture. So you've got designers, advocates, players, the people who play within the system, and the pawns. The pawns are the people who were the victims, where the system was set up not to allow them to gain upward mobility. This is what's really important here. It's known as game theory. Okay, a method in which you have puppets and puppeteers. So it is important for us to know that systems within an organization are created that way. Is what I call the Guinness hypothesis. If you look at Guinness, there's a small white head at the top, and there's all the darker fluid at the bottom of the glass underneath. Okay, this is what they refer to as group closure. Okay, it's a social scientific term, group closure, where a group of people will get together to cause restriction or exclusion of particular groups of people entering that group. So they limit or prohibit groups of people from maintaining a good position within their workplace. This is what it's about. Oh, so there is group closure there. Okay, I give an example of the Ku Klux Klan, because the Ku Klux Klan, they were the ones that came up with the concept white supremacy. When we use the word white supremacy, it was the Ku Klux Klan in America, or members of the Ku Klux Klan, that came with that term. This is not a term that minority groups or so-called BAME groups constructed. They constructed that because after 1865, they now had to share the country with former slaves. And they talked about white supremacy, that we need to be superior to these people. We're not their equal. They're not our equal. This is how this came about. So this is a hegemonic structure. A hegemonic structure means a structure which is put in place to maintain a hierarchical position, okay? What comes out of ethnocentrism? Seeing groups of people through your own lens, which has got stereotypical perceptions and labeling theories. That's how that comes about. So it's to restrict and to exclude, okay? Resource allocation. The money that comes into the company, they want to funnel it or channel it to a particular group of people. And they do not want to see other groups, okay, have any to become recipients of that money or that wealth which is being generated in companies, okay? So this is really important to understand. There's economic factors now that are factored in to a hegemonic structure when we're looking at structural racism and systemic. And then inheritance, okay? This is really important, especially with the middle class, etc. Blood ties comes out of this concept of group closure. I don't want my son or daughter or niece and nephew to be seen with those people over there. So it plays from the individual into the family, into locality, and it is also played out in the wider society. So it is mainstream, it's out there. It's not contained, it's widespread. It's more widespread than people want to believe. Okay, then we will look at the aspect of the Race Relations Act of 65. The Race Relations Act of 65 was to stop racial segregation in Britain. Okay, because in Britain, up until 1865, Black people couldn't go to hotels and motels. They couldn't go to dance halls and restaurants. They couldn't go to seaside resorts and so on and so forth. okay? So racial segregation was in this country. So when they passed the Civil Rights Act in 1965, Britain had to pass a similar act called the Racial Relation Act in 1965 themselves. The Racial Relation Act of 1968 was about housing. Black people were not allowed to live in social housing. Okay, this is important here. So when you got housing associations and council houses, they were not allowed to live in those. Okay, they had to pass an act to allow Black people to live in council housing. So you can see how things have changed somewhat. Housing discrimination still exists even till today, even though this act was passed over 50 years ago. And then the Racial Relation Act of 1976 was passed in order for employment, the labor market, institutions, okay, and the list goes on companies and organizations to stop them from discriminating against people who are of a different color, different creed, religious order, ethnicity, even their genders from different racial groups. This is what this act was passed for, in order to encourage more integration in the labor market. So these are the three main race relation acts which were passed, and we still see there's elements of disparities, okay, where especially in the 68 Act, housing discrimination still persists even till today, based upon skin color, and obviously within the workplace with the Racial Relation Acts of 1976, that still persists and exists. Okay, so these, I've just given you a little summary. So this is what all the Race Relation Acts were. I was going to expand further, but I've already discussed that. Okay, so this is the person, James Watson, a scientist. He wrote this book, DNA. He was one of the founders of DNA in the early to the mid 1950s. This is what he says in 2007 during Black History Month. Okay, Black people are less intelligent, says this doctor. They're less intelligent. So the idea of Black inferiority intellectually is still persisting by scientists. So these are educated people. So we don't have to make excuses for them. Those people who are educated are writing books, for instance, or they're in scientific fields of biology or forensics or whatever the case may be. They still hold these biases and believe in them. Okay, so we look at ethnicity. The only thing I want to say about ethnicity is that usually when I give training about ethnicity and I ask which ethnic group you come from, the only people to put their hands up are people who come from other countries and nations. White people rarely put their hands up, but white people are an ethnic group. Welsh is an ethnic group, okay? The English is an ethnic group, so is the Scottish, so is the Irish. Okay, they are ethnic group. But what they try to teach in this country, that ethnicity is the other. Okay, this is not true. Everyone belongs to an ethnic group. Okay, and this is what needs to be understood. So when training is being done, many of the trainers don't emphasize that white people are part of the ethnic group. And when you look at the word BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, do you know that the E of BAME, the majority of the people who fall into that category are white people. Italians fall into that category. Okay, Spanish fall into that category. Portuguese fall into that category. Welsh, Scottish, Irish, English fall into that category. Canadians fall into that category. Okay, New Zealanders, Australians fall into that. These are white people. So when we look at BAME, BAME is not the only two which is owned really by so-called minority groups. Are Black and Asian. That's taken. So once Black and Asians is taken, B and A is taken. Minorities are who? Minorities, a majority are white people in BAME. LGBT, mental health, okay, gender, women became minority groups when? As early as 1964, white women, okay? So the ME in BAME are white people, and that's not being taught. Okay, so the fact of the matter is that there's a concept of them versus us being engineered and manufactured within the workplace or within society. BAME is not just people of color. It's not. The M are majority white and the E are majority white. This needs to be understood. So white people are an ethnic group. And an ethnic group of people who have shared practices and outlooks that distinguish them from another group of people. Welsh has a language. They don't speak the same language as the English. Even though they do speak English, their food is different, their dress is different, their outlook is different, even their history is different. The same with the Scots, same with the Irish. They were all ethnic groups. Okay, so this is just emphasizing, you know, what ethnicity is. This does not preclude or delete white people from this equation. Okay, this is what's important here. All white people belong to an ethnicity, a white group. When they hear ethnicity, unfortunately, they think it's the other. No, they are an ethnicity as well. Okay, so here I've talked about, what has changed through political terms. So every person who was not British was considered black up until 1980. Even Irish people were considered black. Then when the 1990s came in, we were called ethnic minority. And then when people got onto this political correctness, they said, oh, that's not politically correct. We have to call a minority ethnic. And then we changed to BME. And in the last 5 to 7 years, we are now BAME. And I've explained to you what BAME is: Black, Asian, minorities. Minorities, a majority of them are white. Disabled, disabilities, special educational needs, okay, mental health, LGBT, women. Majority of them are white in the M. So let's not be fooled that BAME means the other. And ethnicities, the majority of them are white. Gypsies, Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, Welsh, English, Scottish, Irish, and the list, French, and the list goes on. They're all ethnic groups. Okay, so I'm coming to an end now. Just give me another 2 minutes to finish off. Love Thy Neighbor was one of those programs which came out in the 1970s. Okay, and it was looking at the Windrush generation that was living next door to a white couple. Okay, because what started happening, banks were not giving loans to Black people to buy houses, even though many of them had 3 or 4 jobs. Okay, because they were brought over here to work. Even Black women were brought over here to work. Okay, not to receive welfare. So the reality was that this film, a lot of ridicule and stuff in this film, in this program, and the word nignog, gollywog, and all these other type of things. It was quite funny for white people, but Black people found it offensive. And you can see a couple actors in, I can't remember their names, who were in EastEnders. Okay. So let's just finish off with this now. We're looking at the multicultural society. This took place in 2009, EastEnders' first all-Black cast in 2009. This is what it says. The BBC confirmed it received almost 250 complaints over the first episode of EastEnders to feature an all-Black cast in its 24-year history, which now would be 34, 35 years now. About 35 years EastEnders been on. A BBC spokesman said 239 complaints had been received from viewers, with 57 received before it was even aired. It is understood that most of the people's complaints were from people who felt it was inappropriate for the BBC to have shown an episode featuring an all-Black cast. And this was supposed to be in honor of the Macpherson report and the death of Stephen Lawrence. So even though the BBC are not really friends of Black people from a historical perspective, they tried to do something as far as race relations were concerned in this country. They decided to use the East End of London, which has a large Black and Asian population, and give them the screen for 25 or for 27 minutes. And there was so much complaints. This is supposed to be the multicultural society that we live in. The people were complaining it's an all-Black cast, as if Blacks don't have their own culture, their own understanding, their own experiences in the British culture, just white people. This is untrue and this is not fair. It goes on to say, some of the complaints felt it was necessary to raise the issue of the Notting Hill riots. Okay, this is what it's about. The Notting Hill riots that took place in 1958 or 1959, where a few people were injured, 1 Black person was killed, and that's what brought about the Notting Hill Carnival, where the Black Caribbean community wanted to bring a festival into Notting Hill in order to live and to amalgamate with the white working class. That's what it came. That's the reason why it came. Okay. I won't read the rest, etc. What I will do now, I just give you a little snippet of what took place when Black people were on the screen of EastEnders, which is supposed to be a multicultural society and a very multicultural cast. And when one group of people were identified in it, there was a lot of complaints and criticism. So I'll end it there. I'll open it for question and answers, hopefully. And I hope you've enjoyed my presentation, my lecture, and some of the points I've brought forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah, I know we've run over, but please do stay on if you have time and take the opportunity to ask questions or make comments with here now, as we have Abu-Bakr still.
Yeah, so any questions? Was there any questions written in the box at all by anybody? 'Cause
Let's have a look.
I'm just opening up now, and I know there's been a bit of conversation.
There
I
was
did
a
ask
question
I
from
did ask a
Tom.
slightly
Yeah,
mangled
Tom.
question.
What do you say?
I did ask a question, but I thought slightly mangled it in the chat. I was struggling with typing on my computer.
Oh, do you want to ask me, or did I cover it after?
Yeah, no, it'd be good to. I think it links a bit to what you were saying about the game theory piece, but I think it's part of the. It was when you were talking about Enid Blyton and Agatha Christie and those types of people in terms
Okay.
of the work they did as the
Yeah.
kind of elites in society, kind of pushing that propaganda and spreading that across the world, etc.
Yeah.
I guess there's something about how consciously they were doing that, as in consciously trying to hold people down or uphold the structure, compared to kind of unconsciously doing it.
Oh, that's a good question. They were very conscious about what they were doing. They were very conscious of what they were doing because they were there to make money on the books. And that was the dominant narrative, which was acceptable within the British Empire, because they were taught that in school. Like I said, when I looked at Peter Fryer, I talked about the educational system, the official curriculum that was established in the school. And up until 1964, 65, when the comprehensive school system came into being, okay, it continued even during that time. They were actually teaching colonial studies, where they were looking at the so-called natives or savages, in the so-called colonies as being less than human. That's what children were taught, whether they were working class, underclass, middle class, whatever the case may be. It went all through the board during the official curriculum, in the secondary moderns schools, in the technical colleges, and also in the grammar schools. And they were the product of that education, Eden Blyton and Agatha Christie. So they were taught this way as youngsters. This was acceptable. And what makes it unfortunate that they were writing children books, and they were disguising that they were disguising it in a sense of attacking children. It was children that they were actually talking about, but using in the form of toys. So they were aware of what they were doing, and they were using a form of psychology, not to make it blatant, but that was certainly the case, yeah.
I guess that's the bit around like how much you're educated to then think in a particular way so that your actions don't feel like they're wrong, if that makes sense. So the system allows you to act in that way, which then brings us up to what we're trying to do now in our work in the organization is that we always kind of look back at previous generations, or even 20 years ago, and I remember gollies and gollywogs and debates about that when I was a kid, etc. But we look back and go like, oh, I can't believe they ever did that. Like those previous generations were ridiculous. But there's stuff. But we also know that there's stuff that's happening now that we don't even realise is happening now, and we won't. And we'll somehow look back on it in 10 or 20 years and be like, oh my God, I can't believe we did that 10 or 20 years ago.
And that does happen. That does happen definitely. And that's something which I've tried to bring out in order to try to look at our unconscious as well as our conscious biases. Whether it's through stereotyping or through labeling. Sometimes we are taught these things at the most pervasive level without even realizing. And like you said, which you're right, sometimes we don't realize until maybe 10, 20, 30 years later. So it's about an unlearning process that we have to
Yeah.
go through. And that's the whole point of, you know, seminars like this, you know, training programs you have in order to update us and to remind us in order for us to become better human beings, as well as being better citizens in the 21st century.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question. Thank you. There's a question from Anna. Anna, are you still here? Do you want to ask the question yourself, maybe?
Thanks, Jalali. Hi. Thank you, Abu-Bakr. That was really interesting. I was really curious about what you said about institutional racism and it being both cause and effect or something like that. And I just made a mental note to ask you about that at the time, like if you wouldn't mind saying a bit more about that.
Right, institutionalized racism, we're looking at cause and effect. It's basically what I identified within game theory. So it's basically where different groups of people from different establishments do their bit. So we look at the political system, the legal system, the educational system. It all feeds into those institutions. And the fact of the matter is when they enter those institutions, etc., people like to hold those principles as doctrines where they do not want to bring about change. Okay, and I think this is what's important here. We know we need to change these institutions because that's what integration is about. Integration is not about, well, we're just going to allow them in and they can't go no further. You know, integration should be about allowing people to interact with one another, learn from one another, okay, and to develop each other and develop themselves in a position where they are right for the job and they themselves can contribute something to that organization or to that company based upon their dexterity. In other words, based upon the skills and qualifications which they have. And I think this is what's really important here when we're looking at institutional racism, that the people who are good for the jobs, etc., are being relegated to the bottom of that particular institution. And unfortunately, the designers and the advocates want to keep that status quo going to ensure that they don't gain elements of upward mobility. So it's like what I said about hegemonic structures. It's to limit or to prohibit. So either they can't be part of the inner group or they're restricted from entering that inner group. They're allowed to come in so far, but they can't go no further. And that's the reality, unfortunately, when we're looking at systemic or institutionalized racism. And it can act itself out in a conscious as well as an unconscious perspective. Not all people are conscious about this. And this is why when I do training like this, I'm realistic because I know that sometimes when we're taught something and socialized and educated in a particular manner, it becomes natural and normal. And then when that gets challenged, we can be very defensive about things because we wasn't taught the other side of the coin. And there's always two sides to a story. I know I've gone on a bit, but I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you.
I have a question if you've got another minute.
Oh, I'm staying here and you use me and spit me out when you're ready.
Thank you. I'm white, but I was born and raised in Africa,
Okay.
and very much embedded in the culture. And when I think about myself, I see myself as a white African. Everything about what I love and my preferences are very much steeped in Africa.
Yeah.
And but when I come over here and I describe myself as a white African, people don't want to accept that because I'm white. What do you think about
the identity?
The other way around.
Yeah, well, you've constructed your own identity, and identity is based upon one's experience. And the thing was, Africa, as a name, as a phrase, as a statement, or as a word, was always put into the realm of savage and barbaric or barbarian, because Charles Montesquieu came up with three classifications of people, either civilized, savage, or barbarian. So civilized was allocated to just whites. And if you look at Africa as a word, that actually had a stigma of being either barbaric or savaged. So when you actually say, I'm a white African, to the people who are educated in this country, that's an oxymoron. That's an oxymoron. How can you be a white African? Because white means civilized, sophisticated, and African means underdeveloped, you know, savage, barbarian, whatever the case may be. But the fact you've had a unique experience, whether you grew up in Kenya or South Africa or Rhodesia, whatever country that you grew up in, you were able to embrace that essence. Okay, so even though you may have came from a privileged class and you had all those different type of things, you were able to absorb other cultural elements, and that is your home. Many colonial administrators or missionaries that went over to Africa, say for instance, they are settled there and they love the country, and their children and grandchildren love the country. And obviously when they came over here, many of them had a cultural shock that the way that they were colonized, the way that they were taught colonization and colonialism and looking at the African as being subordinate, not every white person in Africa fell into that category. If you look at the Leakeys, for instance, of Kenya, okay, the Leakeys are a prime example. They came from missionary parents. He's one of the leading archaeologists in the world. He spoke Swahili. He had no problem with dark-skinned people. You know, Louis Leakey, Mary Leakey, Richard Leakey. Okay, this is a white British family of two, three, or four generations in Kenya. Okay, so, and they loved African culture. So we do know there are people, and they refer to themselves as white Africans. Okay, but that was not accepted in the academies of Cambridge and Oxford, who was funding these archaeological digs in Kenya. So I understand that's your personal identity, your individual identity, and you have to just try to explain to people, this is my own personal experience. I'm still white and I'm still an African because I was born there and I took on the cultural elements within that realm, and I see it as my home. Okay, I see that country as my home. So it is an oxymoron when you say that to people in this country and they try to fathom, what is she trying to say here? It doesn't make sense. A white African. You could say a black African, but not a white African.
Yeah,
because they've been taught that white and Africa are not synonymous. They don't come together, etc. Yeah.
It's amazing because you can the dissonance is palatable when you use that phrase.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Thank you. Any other questions from anybody? Okay, well, that's fine. Well, I hope that I've done justice to this topic. I know I've gone a bit all over the shop, but I wanted to just give you a basic context to race being a floating signifier. So race had gone into the sciences, and scientists said a little bit about race. It went into anthropology. Anthropologists who studied people said their little bit. Then it went into philosophy. Then it was in religion, which was centuries before. Okay, and then it went into all the other sort of disciplines. So that's what I wanted to emphasize, that all the disciplines or subject areas that we are taught in school, college, or university was hijacked by colonialism, colonization, of making the darker races social pariahs. Okay, and by attributing what Charles Montesquieu had created as being either savage or barbarian. What is the difference? A savage is somebody you cannot civilize, and a barbarian is a people who rebel against change. Because one of the concepts that the British were saying when they went to Africa, that we're here to civilize these people or these animals or these creatures. And they had to say that to try to justify more people to go into the army, to go over there to put down these rebellions of colonialism or colonization. That's what this was about. So I hope I've summarized everything. I hope I put things into context, and I just want you to go away with understanding what structural racism is, institutional racism. Use the concept of game theory whenever you are looking at institutions or systems, because this is what many Afrocentrics and people from outside the dominant culture view things, and just synthesize information, just bring it together. okay, to get a better understanding. And those people who are taught and trained in a particular way or a particular manner to think in a particular way, it's going to be difficult for you to unlearn those principles because they're totally embedded. But the mere fact that you're here shows that slight change or that alteration, that psychological alteration. And that's what it's about. None of us are perfect. We all have our biases. We all have our prejudicial principles towards a particular group of people, not just the outsider groups, but our internal groups as well. And how can we change that to be better individuals, practitioners, and citizens in the 21st century? So I hope I've clarified everything, and I hope that my presentation, like I said, was you know, I hope it touched a note with everyone in one way or another. I hope that's the case.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for everybody for turning up. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Abu-Bakr. That was brilliant. That was really great. And it's opened up so much in terms of, in a way, I'm not surprised with where we are at, but at the same time also acknowledge how far we've come. But yeah, there's lots more to be done. Just before we leave, I was just wondering what would you kind of like us to do as an organization? What would be your wish for? We've had this, that now that we have that knowledge, do you have like a wish that you would like us to go ahead with and make an action?
Yeah, I'd like to see the organization discuss on a serious note some of the basic principles that I've mentioned. Some of you may have known about that before. Some of you may only been introduced to that information before, and make it relevant. In Jamaica, we call things, we got this concept called liberty. And what that basically means, to live the reality which I have presented to you, try to make it a livable reality in a sense of discussing, understanding, you know, discoursing, and trying to make those changes collectively, because change can only come if it's done collectively. If it's not done collectively, the pariahs, the social pariahs within any organization or structural system, etc., are usually conceived by the dominant culture of being problematic. Okay, and all I want you to do is try to understand it from the other person's perspective. Know that racism never ended, even though this was being said for the last 20 years. Racism never ended. It never ended. And racism needs to be seen not just as name calling, because that is how the dominant culture looked at race, how it ended, because they didn't hear name calling anymore. But there's another aspect to racism or prejudice or discrimination, and that's the thought pattern and one's emotional feelings. It may not come out in a behavior, okay? So all I just say is just use a platform to enlighten and to educate one another and to understand where you come from both ends of the fences, so you have a better working relationship, because you are practitioners and you are providing a service to clients, okay? And you need to make sure that if you cannot provide an effective service to clients if you haven't got your own house in order. So please discuss in order to get better practitioners so you can provide a more effective service to your clients.
Thanks, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that.
That sounds like a brilliant way to end the session. Thank you very much for that, Abu-Bakr.
Thank you very much for that, Patricia, yeah, and Jalali, everybody which came. I'm glad that you've all stayed on. You know, I hope you're not you're getting money docked from your wages because it's after 10:30. But thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that we had no technical issues or problems this morning. So, you know, Zoom is probably the way forward now, especially if the other person is using presentation slides.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, well, I definitely have to move on, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye now. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Hiya. Yes, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Abu-Bakr.
That's okay. No problem at all. I'm glad that everything
Jay,
went
you're still
fine.
here.